We can't tell you how frustrating it was for us to upload our podcast when we first got started. The websites were clunky, we had data limits, and it was all so confusing. That is, until we found Zencastr. Zencastr is an online platform built for podcasters to not only upload their podcasts, track their listeners, connect their audience, and so much more. Zencastr plans have no upload or download limits, so your cost won't grow as you do. Embed their player that automatically updates to show the latest episode of your show. Zencastr lets you see your podcast downloads along with your traffic, website, and Google Analytics. Zencastr also supports multiple podcasts under one account. The best part is, if you already have a podcast on another platform, you can switch to Zencastr with a one-click importer, all free of charge. So what are you waiting for? Head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/Zencastr to start saving time and money with your podcast today.
Hello and welcome to How to Make a Podcast. My name is John Bunn, and today I'm joined by my best good buddy, Mr. Nick Miller. Nick, co-host to How to Make a Podcast. How are you, my friend?
Always the co-host, never the host. I'm doing really, really good today. This is a big week for us over here at How to Make a Podcast.
Today is a good day, Nick, because one of the questions that we get asked so much inside of our Facebook group and online is how to grow your podcast. And last week we started the conversation about growing a podcast. Today we're continuing it. We're going to be talking about growing your podcast by having guests on your show, what we've done, what our strategy has been, kind of the secrets of everything behind the scenes of what we were thinking about when it came to growing our podcast, because it was very strategic. It wasn't just random. And you mentioned this in the last podcast. We see it a lot where people are just like, hey, would you want to be a guest on my show in all these groups, and not really strategic about what guests they're having. And so for us, we wanted to break down our blueprint, our strategy for what we've been doing to get guests on our show.
Right. So I'm going to go just kind of break this down really, really quick, and then John can, talk about what does maybe some of this information mean a little bit. But there's three things that whenever we're looking for a guest that we're thinking of, and this is specifically looking for someone to come onto my show. We're talking about, okay, we want to have someone on. We're not the other side of this, which we'll get to, is, we come up with a topic and then we look for a person that maybe fits that could talk about that thing. This one is specifically just the person. So the first thing that you want to look at is their following. Is it a good following? What are their numbers like? And I know it's really easy to jump over to something like Instagram or go to their YouTube channel or, something like that and see these really big numbers. So you're looking at your following, okay, this person's great. They have 50,000 Instagram followers. But then do a little digging. And step two is, do they have an engaged following? Okay, and how do you know? Well, you can go and look at their photos or their videos on Instagram. You can look at their YouTube channel and look at their videos and like that kind of stuff. And you can see if people are commenting, if people are watching the videos, if people are, liking the images, all of that kind of stuff. And so do they have an engaged following? We want an engaged following because that means whoever the person is, if a following is engaged, then they're more likely to listen. They are influenced by that person. They are an influencer of people. And then the last thing that you want to think about is something that person could be really, really good to talk about. Okay, something that they would talk about really well. I think I said that really weird. I don't know. But anyways, the topic that they talk about needs to be something that will be engaging. So look at their following, look at their engagement, and then kind of find a topic. And that's with the, hey, I want to have this specific person on my podcast idea. So that's what we're thinking about.
Yeah. For, growing How to Film Weddings podcast, that was, for the first, 70 or 80 episodes, I was kind of behind the scenes on most of all of the finding guests, getting them on the show, that sort of thing. And I wanted to just kind of pull back the curtain on the things that I am really looking at and what I did to secure the guests and different things like that. And so, like Nick said, the first thing that I would look at is, if people that I were following on Instagram, Instagram and YouTube were the main two places that I looked. But if you're in a different, category, and it's better to look and see if they have a big Pinterest following or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, it works across all platforms. But for us with wedding video, Instagram was where it was at, and YouTube. And so if somebody would share a video like, oh my goodness, you got to check this person out, or, I would see somebody that was coming, that was speaking at a workshop, or, I'm always just kind of looking for who's out there, what's going on, was always looking for who are those celebrities in our industry that might be able to add value to the guests or to the listeners that, of our show. And so whenever I would find a new name, I would immediately go over to their Instagram profile. I would just see how many people followed them. I would see, like Nick is saying, the next thing, I would go through all their photos, their videos, and just click and see if someone has 100,000 followers and they're getting 26 likes on their photos, that usually means they bought followers. Or same thing with videos. If they have 10,000 people following them on Instagram, and they post a video and it gets 20 or 30 views, I know that something is not adding up. But
correct,
a lot of these people that you would be looking at would have 4,000 or 5,000 followers, and they'd post a video and they would actually get 10, 12, 13,000 views on their videos, hundreds of comments, and you start seeing, oh, there are people that are really engaged with that person. And that would be whenever I would usually at that point shoot them a message on Instagram and just say, hey, love your work, it's awesome. I would send it from How to Film Weddings, the Instagram account, and just say, you guys are killing it, just wanted to say, good job. I wouldn't just immediately say, hey, do you want to be on our podcast? It would just kind of be, an introduction.
Yeah, that's one thing that John always got on to me about, is because I would just message them and be like, hey, I think you're cool. You want to come on our podcast, and most people were like, yeah, sure, come on. But, there's that idea of, don't try to score on the first date, wine them and dine them a little bit, talk to them, build them up, especially if it's someone that you have no clue who they are. Now with our wedding video podcast, a lot of people in the industry know who we are. So if we approach them, they're like, yeah, sure, I'd love to come on. But whenever you're first starting and you haven't made a name for yourself, you haven't built a brand for yourself, get to know them, invest a little bit in them, and build that relationship a little bit before just, hey, come on my show, come on my podcast.
Yeah, and by just sending them that message, reaching out to saying, hey, you're awesome. I would do this like to maybe 10 or 15 people a week just for a while, just like, you're doing great, like this is amazing. Or I'd comment on some of their videos, like if I really liked their stuff, and I would just kind of, How to Film Weddings, the Instagram account would just start popping up in their feed and talking to them in their video, like comments and stuff like that. And a lot of the people would be like, oh, wow, I didn't even know you guys had a podcast at the beginning. And it would just give them awareness that you existed. And then sooner or later, I might follow back up with a message and be like, wow, you killed it on that destination wedding. It'd be awesome to maybe have you on sometime to talk about destination weddings, or how you did this with a color grade, or, geeky things that they would be flattered that I knew and paid attention to. So it showed them that I wasn't just a spammy, person, but it was like, oh, wow, like they care, they notice something good about my stuff. They notice something about me that's different, that's flattering. I would be interested in, I would keep a spreadsheet, a list of people that I had reached out to that I really wanted on the show. And if they hadn't followed back up, I would, every 5-6 weeks send another message, just kind of slowly building that pipeline of people that could be on our show. And so that strategy in itself yielded us the first 20, 30 guests, no problem. And that was, the more that we did it, the more we learned, like, okay, these kinds of people are the ones we really want to be looking for. And so, Nick, I want to break down a couple of the things that, for us, the sweet spot, if you will, the sweet spot for who it was that we were looking for that would really help us grow. And so if you're thinking about it, if you find somebody that you like them and you want them to be on your show and they have, a few hundred followers, they're probably going to be easier to get in touch with, because they're not like this really famous person in your industry, but whenever you have them, like if you have them on the show and they love it, it's great content, and they share it, we always encourage our guests to share that they were on the podcast. Most of them do it anyway, but they're only going to share it to 200 or 300 people, and which is fine. We talk about numbers, and if that's like a really engaged 200 or 300 people, that could be great. But the sweet spot for us, we found, Nick, somewhere around, somewhere in the 4,000 to 10,000 people, somewhere in there. They have a pretty big following. If they have 4,000 or 5,000 people, they're doing something right. And then if you've looked at that and said, oh, they have 5,000 followers, their photos are getting a ton of engagement, their videos are getting a ton of engagement, like these kinds of things start adding up. And if they're on the show, they're more available than somebody with a lot larger following, but they're not like just super available. So you have to work with their schedule a little bit. But
yeah,
a lot goes into that. Nick, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I need a break. Talk some.
Yeah. So yeah, we said that, kind of 4,000 to 10,000, was a really good spot to be in if they have engaged following and that kind of stuff. And we're kind of specifically talking about Instagram here. I think, now we have had people that have had, 50, 80, 100,000, followers on their accounts or whatever that were legitimate, they didn't purchase them, that kind of stuff. But the deal is whenever you work with someone that has a bigger following, typically their time is not as readily available as someone that doesn't have a big following. They're, not all cases, but usually a bigger following equals some sort of success. And so, they're just busier. They have things to do, or they travel a lot, or, something like that. So that's something that you also need to work out. Another thing is if they have a big following, they might not be as willing to share your podcast or that they were on an episode with you. Okay. I know a few of the people that we've had on that had bigger followings, they didn't do that because while they were fine to be on our brand did not fit with their brand, if that makes sense. And so that's just something that you have to weigh and something that you have to know. Now there's some people that you might have on that have massive followings that are like, yeah, sure, cool. I'm glad to do that. I'm happy to do that. But there's some that aren't. So that's just something that you need to be mindful of, as you are going after these people to come on your podcast. Yeah.
And I know it sounds superficial, almost like, oh, let's look at a number first. But like when it comes down to it, like you said, Nick, if they have a big following, that usually means they have some kind of success, and there's a reason that they have that number. If you are qualifying that following by checking their engagement on their posts, that is going to help give you, a targeted audience of potential guests that have a good following and have an engaged following. And then, from there, you can start talking about the subjects you want to have with that person. And we're going to talk in a little bit about starting with the subject first and then finding, people for that subject. But what we did at the beginning, my strategy, what I really wanted to do was anybody that had a following of any sort in the education space in wedding filmmaking, I wanted to see about getting them on the show. And the more that I got different people on the show that were in educating wedding filmmakers, the more other educators wanted to be on the show too. And sooner or later, it flips a little bit where, people are asking you if they can get on the show to talk about certain things. And you have to be, that's an entirely different subject. We get asked a lot, hey, can I come on your podcast? And, you have to be stingy with that, who's going to be on your podcast, because you said, Nick, they do represent your brand. And so you don't just want to have anybody on if you're following certain people and they just are terrible online to other people and they don't fit your style, or they don't, you don't have to have them on just because they have a following. But, we have had people, like Nick has said, that had 50,000 or more followers, and that's great. But yes, they're harder to get in touch with. It took longer to get them on the show. It gave us cred, but we didn't have a lot of value that we added back to them. So, one guy particularly is an amazing YouTube guy, and he has a huge following, 1 million subscribers on YouTube. And we gave him all the graphics from the episode. He gave us his time, and he did not share, he didn't share that he was on our podcast because it wasn't valuable to him to do that. He's on all kinds of podcasts. We were just happy he didn't charge us to take his time And we think he's really cool for that, because you have to be aware of where you are. Oh, you've got 200 Instagram followers and you have no episodes. Maybe it's not the right time to be asking for that guest to be on your show. And
Exactly.
we say this a lot, but you get one first impression with people. And so you want to slowly tiptoe into this world with guests and everything. And so as we've gotten more and more clout in our industry, now it's a little bit easier 100 episodes in when we reach out to somebody and say, hey, we're John and Nick. We want to have you on the podcast. They're like, oh my goodness, I'm so flattered that you would want me on your podcast. I listened to it. It's, that's been a goal of mine to get on your podcast. And so it changes a little bit based on where you're at. But long story short, when you are finding these people, and this strategy is who's in my industry that has a following that I want, you reverse engineer that and you say, I want to go after them. I want to build a relationship with them. I want to shake hands with them digitally. I want them to realize that I'm not just a spam person, like I'm not spammy. And then you start building that relationship. Then you get them on your podcast. And then that's when you can figure out, this is what I want to talk about with them. And we even in our questionnaires say, what do you feel like you have a wealth of knowledge on to talk about? So
yeah. And just think of it this way, if every time that we have, someone on our podcast that, has a decent sized following, or someone that's a little bit newer, we're adding new followers or subscribers to our podcast, to our Instagram, to our YouTube channel, and all of that kind of stuff. So that's a great, if you have making 50 episodes a year, right, and half of those, so 25 of them, you have a guest on, and if those guests have somewhat of a following, and you're adding, anywhere from 10 to 100 new followers or listeners with every person, that's just going to grow your podcast, grow your channel. There was I remember one wedding video company that we had on our wedding podcast, and the day that our episode went live, we added it was almost 150 new followers on our Instagram page, just because they were on and they had a very massive engaged following. So it can definitely help you to have these kind of people on. It's you need to be selective. Just say, hey, I have this topic, is there anyone that wants to come on? That isn't necessarily the best way. Be purposeful, be mindful, think of your guests and think of your audience and who they might want to talk about. So that's, we talked about, looking for a guest and, some kind of qualifiers that we have used to go by. But we also want to talk about, sometimes you just have a topic that you really, really want to touch on. And so we're going to talk about maybe finding a topic and then finding someone to fill in that topic and what we are thinking about right after this break.
If you have a pulse, you probably hate the subject of taxes and running the bookkeeping portion of your business. But like it or not, if you want to be a successful podcaster, you are going to have to pay attention to your numbers. But don't worry, we have the answer for you, Core Financial. Our friends over at Core Financial have taken the pressure off of us so we can focus on what we love doing most, running our podcast. They take care of all of our taxes, monthly bookkeeping, financial plans, and make sure we take full advantage of all of the tax benefits we qualify for. It just feels good knowing we aren't going to get a big surprise during tax season. If you are serious about building a business with your podcast, head on over to howtomakeapodcast.co/core to see what they can do for you.
So you've got everything you need for your podcast. You've recorded your audio and video. You're so excited, but wait, you don't know how to master the audio or edit the video of your podcast. We know someone who can help. The podcast editors. Picture this. You record both audio and video for your podcast. You upload it to your remote editor, and a few days later, your podcast is ready for you to upload and push to the world. What will you do with your extra time? Connect with sponsors? Grow your Facebook group? Start that project or even course you have dreamed of for months? The possibilities are endless. We are blown away by the podcast editors and love working with them and using their services. They can edit audio, video, or both for your podcast. Don't get stuck trying to do this on your own. Get in touch with the podcast editors today. If you'd like to save 50% off of your first project, head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/thepodcasteditors. Welcome back from break, and I want to share with you this review that Carrie left us. And he said, John and Nick are top-notch guys. Thanks, Carrie. They've already been providing great value everywhere. This podcast is going to take it to the next level. We agree. We are taking things to the next level. Level 11, maybe 12. I don't know.
You agree that we're top-notch guys.
I do agree that we're top-notch guys. We might not be, but I think that we are.
It has been very cool seeing all the reviews come in on Apple Podcast and all the other places. So thank you. Continue to leave reviews. We appreciate that. That helps us a ton.
Yes, thank you, Carrie. So our question of the day, presented by the Podcast Blueprint. Head over to podcastblueprint.co to find out more information and get signed up for our course that is launching in just a couple of days. So here's the question of the day, presented by the Podcast Blueprint. How do you find a guest for a specific topic that you want to cover?
I like this question a lot. So throughout our podcast, there's certain topics that just in our Facebook group, we keep getting asked the same kinds of questions. How do I do this? How do I do that? How do I make money with this or whatever? And so those questions, once you hear them enough, they really start to stand out like, okay, we need to have somebody on that's a pro. One of the things that stood out to me, in our Facebook group was people were wanting to know how to do Facebook ads and Instagram ads. And, so we start writing down all these topics, and this one specifically, we reached out to a couple of the people that are in our group and just said, hey, do you know anybody that is an expert in this category that you know, we're looking for people to have on our podcast? And one of our friends in the group sent us a message and said, hey, this person, have you heard of this person? We asked them on the podcast, and that episode is one of our top 5 episodes in the history of our 100. And, it immediately resonated with so many people. So as you're building a group and building, like, if you have your own Facebook group or you're in other groups and you see these questions all the time, that is a great way to reverse engineer and see, this is a topic that I should be, working on. And we've done this several times where we post a topic or we say, hey, who do you want to see on the show? What topics do you want to hear about on the show? And we'll put a poll in the Facebook group, whether it's our Facebook group or someone else's Facebook group. Like, what do you want to learn more about? And that has given us so much more information on the topic in hand. And then from there, asking in the group, who do you know that is an expert on this? Or if you know your niche really well, you already know some people. Yeah.
Here's just another plug for having something like a Facebook group for your podcast, where we're crowdsourcing the types of topics and types of things that people want to hear about. And based on what they say, we know that it's going to be an episode that people want to hear about. And so for this one, you're kind of saying, okay, the subject matter is the draw. Not the name attached to it, but the subject matter is the draw. So whenever you find a person, we've had people talk on about, Facebook, Instagram ads on our How to Film Weddings podcast, about YouTube, about SEO, these topics about mastering your audio, stuff where the people themselves that talked about it were not necessarily big names in our industry or known in our industry, but the topic that they talked about was very valuable. And so our people tuned in to listen to that. So as you're thinking of topics that you can bring in, this is a great way to build your audience and to get listenership. And if they are someone that has a little bit of a following, that's kind of a bonus, because now their audience is being introduced to you, and because they might be subject adjacent, they're not within your niche, but they're very similar and kind of close to it. And so now this other niche is being introduced to you and your product and your podcast because you've had them on. So it's a great way to go about it that way as well.
And whenever, we were growing our podcast, one of the subjects was Facebook marketing. And I remember looking at different people that were experts in the field and doing the same exact things that we taught you at the first part of this episode by looking at their following, seeing their engagement, seeing, what kind of people follow them, that's the kind of thing you need to be looking for. If it's somebody that's just a friend of a friend that has run some Facebook ads one time, that's different than like a Facebook marketing expert that is good about being in front of camera and good on, being on a podcast and has something to benefit from being, and that's another thing is like, if they can benefit from being on your podcast, you can tell them, yeah, we've got a few hundred, wedding filmmakers that would be interested in paying for your product if you provide some free value to them, that sort of a thing. And so, yes, we definitely would say field the subject and then find somebody that does have a good following that is engaged to help you drive that point home. And, it's kind of this balance in your podcast of like, you have to be thinking about the direction of where you're taking your podcast, where you want it to go, and say, okay, we need some good content on these things. How can we give back, like give good content to our listeners? And, the content being king 100%. And so once a month, once every other month, there needs to be something that's just like such deep, good content. But a lot of people feel like every episode has to just be this like banger of an episode that's just mind blowing. And really, it's just all about that consistency. It's all about staying consistent with your content, giving people things to think about, just getting their mind on, like that sort of a thing, whether that's an entertaining podcast or if it's an educational podcast, like the consistency and then keeping people in front of them that are helping you push the narrative forward in your episode.
Yeah, definitely. So just be mindful about all of this as you're, looking for podcast guests and everything. Something that John and I wanted to touch on here is when it comes to growth and it comes to numbers and, having people with followings and all this kind of stuff. Like for our How to Film Weddings podcast, we have well over 100 episodes, we're like 110-ish or so on that podcast. And we've probably had guests on, 60% probably. Probably over half we've had guests.
Somewhere in there,
yeah. And with that, we have grown it to, across, all of our channels, we're between 15 and 25,000, listens or downloads or whatever a month. But it's been a slow build. And we're just a couple months away from us doing this for 2 years. And so it wasn't something that, we did this one time and then, oh, boom, we got 15,000 downloads on one episode or, something like that. So it's taken time, it's taken energy, it's taken quite a while for us to build this. And the thing that we come back to a lot in growing your audience is going to be consistency. And that's going to be consistency. I'm specifically talking about timing, right? Your audience knows on Tuesday, that's new podcast day for your podcast. And so you're doing that every single week. And I think that being consistent like that is just as important, if maybe not more important, than having quality guests and quality conversations on every single week. So it's been a slow build, but we are now, being almost 2 years into this, benefiting from all this hard work that we've had to do over the last, 2 years to get to where we are now.
Yeah. It's funny to look back at the numbers and say, oh, wow, the first month we were so excited to get a couple hundred downloads. And so, now in the month of June, as we're recording this, it's like thousands of downloads per episode. We're almost getting in February, I think we did 8 episodes and we're like 75% as many downloads this month with 4 episodes. And it's funny to think about how it feels like you said it was almost 2 years, and I was like, oh my goodness, how in the world has that been? It feels like a long time, but it also feels like a really short time.
Yeah.
But if your mindset is thinking about, I'm going to be consistent for 6 months, once a week or once every other week, and setting that schedule and training your listeners and continually giving them good, consistent content and putting new people in front of them and exposing your podcast to new people by having guests on, averaging 100 new listeners a week is 5,200 new listeners a year. And it's like maybe 100's not attainable. Maybe it's half of that. But in a year, you could have 2,500 listeners if you just implement these simple strategies. And so, it's funny. There's been a few times that, boom, an episode hit and, we got a lot of followers. We weren't even really expecting it, or, oh, wow, there was 1,000 downloads today. That's crazy. And so it really, sometimes you hit and it pops, it goes, whatever. But for the most part, it's a pretty just boring drip that's continually growing, and it's filling up this massive, pool with one drip at a time. And you look around and it's like, wow, there's a lot of water in here. And so that's what it is taking that approach. And so, definitely mark this episode, listen back to it, be thinking about who you should have on your podcast, what they could do for you. Get really strategic about your guests. We would challenge you to not just be willy-nilly about it. Don't just randomly have people on your show.
Yeah. And if you like this content, we go into a lot more detail in the podcast blueprint. If you'd like information on that, head over to podcastblueprint.co. Thank you again so much for listening to this week's episode of the How to Make a Podcast. And until next time, we'll see you.
See you guys.